You get $15, Dad. That's enough for a Greyhound bus back to your frozen shack. Those cold, sharp words didn't just hurt. They were designed to tear away whatever dignity I had left. It was a freezing Friday morning in Toronto, and we were standing inside a pristine, glass-walled boardroom on Bay Street, high above the snow-swept financial district. My son, Tristan, stood there looking down at me, draped in a $3,000 cashmere overcoat, his face twisted into a smug, victorious grin. He said those words loud enough for every high society lawyer and Bay Street elite in the room to hear. He wanted them to witness my absolute humiliation. He wanted them to see his poor, disgraced father get thrown out like garbage. He thought he had won. He thought he was looking at a broken old man with no cards left to play. But there was something Tristan didn't know. A dark, hidden truth that would turn his absolute certainty into a complete, irreversible ruin. Before I reveal how a quiet father executed a cold, calculated plan to dismantle his son's empire piece by piece, please take a moment to subscribe to the Vengeance Never Sleeps channel. Here, we tell the stories of those who thought they were untouchable, only to find out that the quietest people always harbor the most devastating plans. Once you've subscribed, leave a comment below letting me know which Canadian province or city you are listening from today. Whether you are tuning in from the snowy woods of Ontario, the historic streets of Quebec, the windy plains of Alberta, or the coast of British Columbia, I want to hear from you. Now, let us journey back to where the ice first began to crack. For the past 20 years, my world had been defined by the scent of fresh pine, linseed oil, and the endless silence of the Canadian wilderness. I am Arthur Vance. At 68 years old, I lived a quiet, solitary life in Gravenhurst, Muskoka, a rugged, beautiful region of Ontario surrounded by deep lakes and ancient granite rocks. To the wealthy tourists from Toronto, Muskoka was a summer playground. To me, it was a fortress. Here, in my small, heated workshop, the world couldn't reach me. I wasn't the disgraced architect whose name had been dragged through the dirt. I was just a carpenter. My hands, calloused, scarred, and weathered by the brutal northern winters, knew how to shape raw timber into honest, solid things. Wood never lies. It doesn't betray you. It doesn't write false narratives. It simply endures. I had been building a rocking chair, running my fingers along the smooth, curved armrest, when the bitter, sub-zero winter wind rattled my workshop doors. The quiet peace of my morning was suddenly shattered. My old, dusty flip phone sitting on the workbench began to vibrate violently, its harsh buzzing sound an unwelcome intrusion into my sanctuary. I hit the kill switch on the wood planer, and as the machine whined down to a halt, the sudden silence of the forest rushed in, heavy and suffocating. I wiped the sawdust from my hands onto my denim apron and looked at the screen. A single name stared back at me: Tristan Vance, my son. A boy I had raised, a boy I had sacrificed everything to protect, and a boy who hadn't spoken a single word to me in 2 decades that wasn't a demand, a curse, or a cold insult. I flipped the phone open, my voice raspy and dry from hours of silence. "Hello, Tristan." "He's actually answering," Tristan's voice came through, dripping with clinical, detached amusement. "Listen closely, Arthur. Your mother is dead. She had a stroke last week at the Westmount Estate in Montreal. The funeral is already over, and no, you weren't on the guest list. I didn't need your dusty old face ruining my networking opportunities. The news of Elizabeth's passing hit me like a wave of freezing water, but I didn't let my breath hitch. I kept my face entirely impassive. She was gone. The brilliant, ambitious, and utterly destructive woman I had once loved was now just a memory. But that's not why I'm calling," Tristan continued, his tone turning sharp, arrogant, and predatory. "Her estate lawyers at Bouchard and Associates in Ottawa require your presence for the reading of the will this Friday on Bay Street. You have to be there to sign off on your own worthlessness. And just so you understand exactly where you stand," the phone vibrated again. A multimedia message popped up on my screen. I opened the image. It was a photograph taken in the alleyway behind our old family mansion in Westmount, Montreal. There, thrown carelessly into a green plastic garbage bin amidst rotting food and discarded cardboard boxes, was my grandfather's hand-forged carving axe. It was a beautiful, heirloom tool, stamped with my family's mark, the very tool that had taught me how to carve my first piece of wood. Across the photo, Tristan had typed a short, vicious text message: "Trash belongs in the trash. See you on Friday, old man." A hot, glowing ember of rage, buried deep beneath 20 years of silence and resignation, slowly began to burn in my chest. It wasn't a wild, uncontrolled fire. It was a calculated, focused heat. He hadn't just insulted me, he had desecrated my family's legacy. He wanted a public execution. He wanted to watch me crumble. I closed the phone with a quiet, deliberate click and set it down. I looked around my workshop, then walked into my small cottage. Past the flannel shirts and worn jeans in my closet, I pulled out a dusty garment bag. Inside hung my only suit. A charcoal gray wool suit I hadn't touched since the day my old life was stolen from me. Tristan wanted a show. He wanted to see if the old carpenter had any fight left in him. I took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. The winter storm was coming to Toronto, but I was bringing a storm of my own. And when the quiet father finally decided to speak, the entire Bay Street fortress would learn that vengeance never sleeps. There is a profound, honest weight to the silence in Muskoka. When the snow falls here, it blankets the earth in a quiet dignity that makes you forget the chaotic greed of the city. But when Tristan's voice came through the receiver, that peace evaporated instantly. His voice didn't belong to the woods. It belonged to sterile, air-conditioned offices, to $1,000 suits, and to the ruthless, high-stakes game of Bay Street. He brought the coldness of a corporate ledger right into the warm, sawdust-scented air of my sanctuary. "I'm only going to say this once, Arthur," Tristan sneered, his voice completely devoid of any grief or warmth. "Mother is gone. A sudden stroke at the Westmount Mansion in Montreal last Tuesday. It was quick, which is fortunate, because she didn't have time to mess up the business operations before she passed. I stood perfectly still, my hand gripping the edge of my workbench. Elizabeth was gone. The woman who had once been my wife, the co-creator of the empire we built together, had vanished from the earth. I wanted to feel a wave of sorrow, but all I felt was a strange, hollow numbness. Tristan didn't wait for me to process the news. He didn't care about my grief. He was already moving on to his real agenda. "I suppose you're wondering why you didn't hear about the funeral," Tristan continued, let out a short, mocking laugh. "The service was held yesterday at the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal. It was a beautiful, exclusive event. The mayor was there. The top real estate executives from Quebec and Ontario were there, and I made damn sure your name was nowhere near the guest list." I closed my eyes, picturing the towering, historic spires of Notre Dame, a place of sacred memory. "Let's be realistic, Arthur," Tristan whispered, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "Look at yourself. You're a disgraced, 68-year-old carpenter living in a shack. I couldn't risk you showing up in your faded Walmart flannel and worn-out boots, smelling like cheap pine shavings, and dragging our family's pristine reputation through the mud in front of the Montreal media. I had a brand to protect. I couldn't let your ragged, pathetic appearance stain the Tremblay legacy. So, I blocked you. You weren't wanted there." The cruelty was deliberate, a sharp blade designed to pierce my soul. I looked down at my worn leather work apron, stained with glue and oil. Slowly, deliberately, I untied the straps, took it off, and hung it on the wooden peg by the door. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I let his venomous words settle into the quiet room, transforming from an insult into an absolute, unbreakable resolve. "But don't worry, you still have one final obligation," Tristan said, his voice returning to its sharp, commanding business tone. "Her estate lawyers at Bouchard and Associates have summoned you. The official reading of the will is this Friday at 10 o'clock sharp. Their offices are on the top floor of the tower on Bay Street, Toronto. Don't be late, and for God's sake, try to find a suit that doesn't look like it was pulled from a dumpster." "I have no legal claim to Elizabeth's estate, Tristan," I said, my voice flat and steady. "We settled our affairs 20 years ago." "Oh, I know you aren't getting a single dime," Tristan laughed, a triumphant, malicious sound. "My mother despised you, but the lawyers claim your physical presence is a mandatory legal formality before they can release the primary assets to me. You have to be there in person to sign the waiver, to officially hear the court declare that you are a financial zero. A documented, notarized confirmation of your complete irrelevance to this family." He paused, letting the final insult hang in the freezing air. "Personally, I just want to watch your face when the lawyer reads it out loud. I want to see that quiet, fake dignity of yours crumble. It's the least you can do for me after all these years." "I will be there, Tristan," I said quietly. "Good," he snapped, and the line went dead with a harsh, static click. I set the phone down. The silence of Muskoka rushed back in, but it was no longer peaceful. It was the calm before a devastating storm. Tristan believed he was summoning me to his kingdom to witness his coronation. He believed his wealth, his high society connections, and his cold arrogance made him invincible. He had no idea that he had just signed his own eviction notice. I walked over to my charcoal gray suit, brushing a speck of dust from the shoulder. The stage was set, the players were ready, And this Friday, the elite of Bay Street would witness exactly what happens when the quiet father finally decides to collect his debt. The early morning train from Muskoka pulled into Union Station just as the sun began to rise, a pale, weak disk struggling to pierce the thick winter smog of Toronto. Stepping off the platform, the transition was jarring. The clean, silent snow of the north was replaced by the gray slush of the city, and the crisp smell of pine was instantly swallowed by the cold exhaust of Bay Street. I pulled the collar of my coat tight against the biting wind as I began the 3-block walk toward the financial district. I was wearing my only suit, the charcoal gray wool suit I had pulled from the back of my closet. It was clean, and I had pressed it myself back in Gravenhurst until the creases were as sharp as a chisel, but there was no hiding its age. The shoulders were too padded, the lapels too wide, and the cut far too generous compared to the slim, modern silhouettes of the city. It was the exact suit I had worn 20 years ago to the courthouse in Montreal on the day Elizabeth and Tristan stripped me of my life. It still carried the faint, nostalgic scent of cedar and mothballs, the scent of a preserved past. I wore it not because I had nothing else, but because it was the armor of my greatest defeat. I wanted to remember the coldness of that courtroom as I walked into this one. The corporate headquarters of Bouchard and Associates didn't just occupy space on Bay Street, it dominated it. It was a soaring cathedral of dark glass and pristine black granite, designed to make anyone who entered feel utterly insignificant. As I pushed through the heavy revolving doors, the chaotic noise of the city was instantly severed, replaced by a deep, reverent quiet that smelled of expensive citrus cleaner, leather, and immense wealth. My old, leather-soled dress shoes made a loud, hollow click-clack on the mirror-like marble floor. I could feel the eyes of the receptionist and several young corporate lawyers, men and women in their early 30s wearing $5,000 tailored garments, slide over me. In a single, fluid motion, they scanned my outdated suit, my slightly scuffed shoes, and my weather-beaten face, immediately categorizing and dismissing me. I was a smudge of grease on their pristine canvas. I didn't belong in their world of mergers, acquisitions, and offshore accounts. To them, I was just a relic, a ghost from an era they had successfully buried. But I kept my chin up and my stride steady. An architect knows that a building's polished facade often hides the weakest foundations. The elevator doors on the top floor slid open to reveal a private reception lounge overlooking the frozen harbor of Lake Ontario, and there they were, waiting for me. Tristan stood at the center of the room, flanked by his accessories. Marcus Kane, his calculating financial advisor, and Genevieve, his incredibly beautiful but thoroughly artificial girlfriend from the bridal path. The moment Tristan saw me, a cruel, mocking sneer spread across his face. He didn't greet me. Instead, he turned to the receptionist and the paralegals standing nearby, raising his voice so the entire room could hear. "Look what the wind blew in, everyone," Tristan announced, gesturing toward me with a gold-ringed hand. "My father, Arthur. I told you all he was a homeless parasite living in a shack, but I didn't think he'd actually show up looking like a street beggar. Try not to let him touch any of the leather furniture." Genevieve let out a sharp, mocking giggle. She was holding a hot, $9 designer latte from a boutique cafe downstairs. As she walked past me toward the boardroom doors, she deliberately tripped over her own designer heels, angling her cup so that the hot, milky liquid splashed directly across the lapel of my charcoal gray suit. "Oh, my God. I am so incredibly sorry," Genevieve gasped, her voice dripping with theatrical, mocking sarcasm. She reached into her expensive leather purse, pulled out a single, crumpled $5 Canadian bill, and tossed it carelessly at my chest. The blue plastic bill fluttered to the floor, landing right next to my worn shoes. "Here, go buy yourself a coffee and get that dusty old rag dry cleaned. It probably hasn't seen a washing machine since the 90s anyway." Marcus Kane chuckled softly, adjusting his glasses, while Tristan beamed with absolute, triumphant pride. They expected me to break. They expected me to yell, to pick up the money, or to shrink away in absolute humiliation. But I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for the $5 bill. I calmly pulled a clean, white linen handkerchief from my breast pocket and dabbed the wet stain on my lapel with slow, meticulous care. Then, I folded the handkerchief, placed it back, and raised my head. I looked directly into Genevieve's eyes. My gaze was completely calm, cool, steady, and entirely empty of anger. I didn't see a powerful, wealthy socialite. With my architect's eye, I looked right through her perfect makeup, her designer dress, and her expensive perfume, seeing the hollow, rotting structural decay of her character underneath. My silence was deafening. The smirk on her face slowly withered under my steady gaze, a flicker of uneasy hesitation crossing her eyes. "Let's go inside," I said, my voice quiet, deep, and steady as the Muskoka granite. "The lawyers are waiting." I walked past them, pushing open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom myself. They thought they had just initiated my public execution. They had no idea they had just walked into the courtroom of their own doom. The boardroom of Bouchard and Associates was designed to feel like a chamber of supreme judgment. In the center sat a massive, 20-foot conference table carved from a single piece of dark, flawless African mahogany, its surface so highly polished it reflected the cold, gray winter sky of Toronto pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Tristan marched to the far end of the table, pulling out the massive leather high-back chair that occupied the head of the room, instantly claiming it as his throne. Marcus Kane and Genevieve sat on either side of him like hungry lieutenants waiting for their slice of the kingdom. I took a seat near the door, far from their circle, resting my hands on the pristine wood. The heavy silence of the room was broken by the sound of a side door swinging open. A tall man in his late 60s walked in, carrying a thick, red wax-sealed leather portfolio. This was Mr. Bouchard. He was a legendary figure in the Canadian legal community, a man who had spent decades navigating the Supreme Courts of Ottawa. He wore a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray three-piece suit that spoke of quiet, generational authority rather than flashy, brand-name wealth. His eyes, sharp and calculating behind his gold-rimmed reading glasses, swept across the room. He bypassed Tristan's outstretched, gold-ringed hand entirely, walking straight to my end of the table. "Mesher." "Arthur Vance," Bouchard said, his voice deep, resonant, and carrying the unmistakable weight of a man who respects honor above money. "It has been far too long. Thank you for making the journey down from Muskoka today." "Thank you, Master Bouchard," I replied quietly, offering a respectful nod. Tristan's hand remained frozen in midair, his face tightening with a sudden flash of irritation. He quickly pulled his hand back, clearing his throat loudly to reassert his dominance. "Yes, yes. Hello, Bouchard. Let's get this circus moving. My time is valuable, and I have a celebration luncheon booked at the Harbor 60 Steakhouse in an hour." Bouchard did not look at Tristan. He simply walked to the head of the table opposite him, sat down with methodical slowness, and unclasped his leather portfolio. The message was subtle, but crystal clear. Tristan's self-appointed crown meant absolutely nothing in this room. Master Bouchard adjusted his reading glasses, flattened the first page of the document, and cleared his throat. "This is the last will and testament of Elizabeth Tremblay Vance, registered under the laws of the province of Ontario," Bouchard began, his voice a steady, neutral monotone that commanded absolute attention. "Being of sound mind and body, I hereby declare my final wishes, revoking all prior testaments." Tristan leaned back, crossing his arms, a smug grin returning to his face. He looked at me, tapping his fingers, waiting for his victory to be read into the record. "First," Bouchard read, "I direct that all my just debts and estate expenses be settled. Second, regarding those who maintained my household with dignity when my own blood was too busy social climbing in Toronto, I give and bequeath the sum of $50,000 Canadian, completely tax-free, to my housekeeper of 25 years, Marie-Claire Baptiste. Her loyalty was a comfort I did not deserve." Tristan rolled his eyes, whispering something dismissive to Genevieve, who scoffed in return. "Third," Bouchard continued, completely ignoring their reaction, "I give and bequeath the sum of $25,000 Canadian to my driver, Jean-Pierre Tremblay, for his decades of silent discretion and safe passage through the winters of Montreal." I felt a small, warm smile touch the corners of my lips. Marie-Claire and Jean-Pierre. They were good, honest people. They had seen the toxic decay of the Tremblay household up close, yet they had always offered me a quiet nod of respect whenever I was forced to visit. They deserved every single dollar. But as Bouchard turned to the third page, the atmosphere in the room began to fracture. Marcus Kane, Tristan's financial advisor, was growing visibly agitated. His shark-like smile had completely vanished. To a man whose entire existence was measured in profit margins and return on investments, listening to $75,000 of unproductive capital being given away to the help was an absolute agony. He began to tap his expensive gold pen violently against the polished wood of the table. Click, click, click. The sound echoing sharply in the quiet boardroom. "Mr. Bouchard, if I may," Marcus Kane interrupted, leaning forward and sliding a handwritten financial outline across the table. His voice was tight, thin, and dripping with impatience. "We really don't need to waste time reading through these minor, sentimental tips for the servants. My client, Tristan, has a multi-million-dollar corporation to run. Can we please skip the trivial details and get straight to the primary assets? We need to review the liquid stock transfers and the $160 million real estate portfolio of Tremblay Designs. The clicking of the pen stopped. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Mr. Bouchard slowly stopped reading. He did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He simply raised his head, his eyes freezing Marcus Kane in place. With agonizing, methodical deliberation, Bouchard took off his gold-rimmed reading glasses. He folded them, placed them gently on top of the parchment, and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. When he spoke, his voice had dropped several octaves, losing its neutral legal tone and becoming a cold, razor-sharp instrument of judicial authority. "Mr. Kane, Bouchard said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Let me educate you on the legal protocols of this province. This is not a quarterly corporate earnings report. This is the official, solemn reading of a deceased woman's final wishes. In this boardroom, you are not a manager, you are not an executive, and you do not dictate the pace of my proceedings." Marcus Kane's face instantly flushed a pale, humiliated white. He swallowed hard, his hand freezing over his pen. "If I hear your pen click one more time, or if you attempt to interrupt these proceedings again," Bouchard continued, his gaze like iron, "I will have security escort you out of this building immediately, and I will file a formal complaint with the Law Society of Ontario for the obstruction of estate administration. Do I make myself clear?" Marcus Kane opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately at Tristan, but Tristan was staring at the table, refusing to catch his eye. The arrogant financial wizard had just been thoroughly dressed down like a misbehaving child. "Very well, Master," Bouchard said, calmly putting his reading glasses back on and picking up the thick document. "Let us continue." I sat in my corner, watching the first cracks appear in their flawless, expensive armor. They thought they were here to sign off on their kingdom. They had no idea that Mr. Bouchard was just clearing the field, and the real storm was about to hit them. Mr. Bouchard adjusted his glasses, his face completely impassive as he looked at the next page of the document. The brief lesson in legal etiquette had left Marcus Kane utterly silent, his gold pen resting uselessly on the dark wood of the table. But my late wife, Elizabeth, was never satisfied with merely silencing her enemies. She preferred to dismantle them entirely. "We now move to Article 6, Bouchard read, his voice clear and echoing off the glass walls. "Regarding the personal and professional associates of my son, Tristan Vance. First, to his chief financial advisor, Mr. Marcus Kane." Marcus sat up slightly, a desperate, greedy light returning to his eyes. He smoothed his tie, trying to regain his composure, expecting his reward for years of creative accounting. "I give and bequeath to Mr. Marcus Kane," Bouchard read, "the exact sum of 5,000 Canadian dollars. Marcus's eager smile froze. 5,000. In the high-stakes world of Toronto finance, that was a microscopic tip, an insult wrapped in a legal document. But Elizabeth was not done. "However," Bouchard continued, his tone dropping into a cold, mocking cadence, "this bequest is strictly contingent upon a legally binding condition. Mr. Kane must use these funds to immediately enroll in and complete the course on professional ethics and financial transparency at the University of Toronto. My private audits of Tremblay Designs have revealed that Mr. Kane possesses a severe, bordering on criminal, deficit in these areas, particularly regarding his recent offshore tax maneuvers. Should he refuse to enroll, this sum will be forfeited to the Canada Revenue Agency to assist in their inevitable audit of his personal accounts." The color drained completely from Marcus's face. His hands began to shake as he gripped the edge of the table. He wasn't just insulted. He was compromised. His entire career was flash-fried in a single paragraph. Tristan stared at his financial advisor in sheer disbelief, but before he could speak, Mr. Bouchard turned his gaze to the young woman sitting on Tristan's right. Genevieve was still clutching her expensive designer purse like a shield, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and greed. "Second," Bouchard read on, "to my son's current romantic companion, Genevieve." Genevieve perked up, her glossy lips parting in anticipation. She expected a piece of the jewelry collection, perhaps a diamond necklace from the family vault. "I leave to Genevieve," Bouchard read, "the exact high-quality counterfeit Hermes Birkin handbag currently sitting in the closet of my Westmount estate in Montreal. Specifically, the very same fake bag she attempted to swap for my authentic, vintage orange crocodile Birkin during her uninvited visit to my bedroom last month. I bequeath this replica to her as a permanent monument to her own cheap, deceitful nature. May she carry it as a reminder that imitation luxury can never disguise a fraudulent soul." The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and deafening. Genevieve's face turned from a smug, polished mask into a hideous, blotchy red. Her mouth dropped open in complete horror. She had not only been denied her fortune, she had been exposed as a common, petty thief in a room filled with senior lawyers, her boyfriend, and me. The man she had spilled her latte on just minutes prior. The humiliation was too raw, too public, and too devastating. The illusion of Genevieve's high society sophistication evaporated in a single second. She slammed her hands onto the mahogany table, her chair flying backward against the wall as she screamed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated rage. "This is a lie! This is an absolute setup!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Mr. Bouchard. "That miserable, psychotic old witch! She was insane!" She was a senile, bitter old parasite who hated me because I'm young and beautiful. She made this up to ruin me. "Genevieve, shut up!" Tristan roared, standing up, his face burning with a dark, suffocating shame. But Genevieve was completely out of control, her eyes wild with fury as she turned on Tristan. "Don't you dare tell me to shut up! Your mother was a monster, and your father is a broke, pathetic loser. You promised me a penthouse in Yorkville. Tristan, you promised me millions, and instead, I'm being dragged by a dead woman in front of these peasants. In a flash of pure, desperate rage and overwhelming humiliation, Tristan's self-control snapped. He swung his arm, delivering a sharp, stinging slap across Genevieve's face. The loud crack of the impact echoed off the boardroom glass. Genevieve stumbled back, clutching her reddened cheek, her eyes wide with shock as tears began to ruin her perfect makeup. "Get her out of here," Tristan growled, his voice shaking with venom as he pressed the intercom button on the table. "Security, get this hysterical thief out of my sight and out of this building immediately." Within seconds, two burly security guards in dark suits burst through the double doors. They grabbed Genevieve by her arms, dragging her backward out of the room as she continued to shriek curses that echoed down the hallway of the skyscraper. Tristan slowly sat back down, his chest heaving, his hands trembling as he stared blankly at the mahogany table. Marcus Kane sat beside him, pale, silent, and thoroughly defeated. The proud, untouchable alliance that had walked into this room to conquer my estate was now fractured, bleeding, and humiliated. I sat in my corner, completely still, watching the wreckage of their arrogance. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The quiet father was simply watching the first cards fall. And the real storm hadn't even begun. With Genevieve dragged out of the room in disgrace and Marcus Kane sitting there pale and silenced, the boardroom returned to a cold, suffocating quiet. Tristan adjusted the cuffs of his Tom Ford suit, trying desperately to piece his shattered ego back together. He took a deep breath, puffed out his chest, and looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated malice. To him, the destruction of his companions was just a minor sideshow. All that mattered now was the crown. He was ready to claim his kingdom. Mr. Bouchard raised his eyes, looking over his reading glasses at Tristan before returning to the document. "We now move to Article 7, Bouchard read, his voice a flat, unwavering monotone. "The disposition of the primary estate. To my son, Tristan Vance, I give, devise, and bequeath my multi-million-dollar penthouse apartment located in the prestigious neighborhood of Yorkville, Toronto, completely unencumbered." A massive, visible wave of relief washed over Tristan. He let out a loud, triumphant sigh, leaning back in his leather chair as the color returned to his face. "Furthermore," Bouchard continued, "I bequeath to him my entire private collection of Patek Philippe watches, currently stored in the secure vault of our family estate." Tristan let out a sharp, arrogant bark of a laugh. He looked across the long mahogany table at me, his eyes gleaming with a predatory, victorious light. "Hear that, old man? The Yorkville penthouse, the Pateks, all of it. It's mine. Every single brick of her empire belongs to me." But Mr. Bouchard did not stop reading. He held the document steady, his voice dropping into a register that was dangerously quiet, yet echoed with absolute clarity. "And finally, regarding my ex-husband, Arthur Vance." Tristan leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his smile widening into a grotesque, mocking grin. He was ready to hear the final, legal stamp of my worthlessness. "To Arthur Vance," Bouchard read, "I give and bequeath the exact sum of $15 Canadian to be paid immediately in cash from the estate's petty reserves. This sum is explicitly designated to cover the cost of a one-way Greyhound bus ticket from Toronto back to his frozen shack in Muskoka. It is my final wish that he take this money and remove his pathetic, dusty presence from my family's legacy forever." The words landed in the room like a block of ice shattering on stone. A split second of silence passed, and then the dam broke. Tristan didn't just laugh, he roared. A loud, booming, and hysterical sound of pure, malicious triumph erupted from his chest. He stood up from his chair, his body shaking with the force of his laughter, tears of malicious joy streaming down his face. He reached into the pocket of his expensive trousers and pulled out a slim, black alligator skin wallet. With slow, theatrical deliberation, he flipped it open, pulled out a single green $20 Canadian bill, and threw it violently across the mahogany table. The plastic bill skidded across the polished wood, stopping right in front of my hands. "Here! Take it, old man!" Tristan shrieked, his voice cracking with sadistic pleasure. "Take the 20! Keep the change and buy yourself a hot coffee at the bus station. Don't say your family never gave you anything." Marcus Kane, seeing an opportunity to claw his way back into Tristan's good graces after his own public humiliation, immediately joined in the mockery. He let out a loud, sycophantic chuckle, shaking his head with mock pity. "Incredible, Tristan." "Just incredible," Marcus flattered, leaning toward his new master, his eyes shining with desperate greed. "A $15 bus fare. Your mother truly knew how to handle a bankrupt parasite. It's a beautifully appropriate end for a failed architect." They laughed, their voices bouncing off the glass and mahogany walls of the high-rise tower, filling the room with the toxic scent of their arrogance. But I did not move. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the $20 bill resting on the table. I sat perfectly still in my chair, my calloused, weathered hands resting quietly on the smooth, hand-carved handle of my pine wood walking cane, the one I had crafted myself in the silence of Muskoka. I simply looked at the green bill, and then I raised my eyes, looking directly at my son and his groveling financial advisor. My silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a physical storm building over the Great Lakes. It was a silence so absolute, so cold, and so utterly unbothered that it began to push back against their frantic, desperate laughter. Slowly, the chuckles from Marcus died out. Tristan's hysterical roaring began to falter, his smirk tightening as my empty, steady gaze held his. He expected me to scream, to cry, to crawl on the floor for his money. Instead, I gave him nothing. I sat there like a monument of solid granite, watching them play their childish games. "Are you finished?" I asked, my voice incredibly soft, low, and steady, cutting through the fading laughter like a frozen scalpel. Tristan scoffed, pulling his jacket tight. "Yeah, I'm finished, old man. Pick up your bus money and get the hell out of my boardroom." But as he turned to look at the lawyer to finalize the paperwork, he noticed that Mr. Bouchard had not moved. He was still sitting at the head of the table, his hand resting on a second, unopened folder bound with thick, red wax. The quiet father had taken their best blow, and now the trap was about to spring. Tristan was practically vibrating with adrenaline. He snatched up the gold fountain pen from the desk, ready to sign the release forms, his eyes already drifting toward the boardroom doors as if he were already stepping into his celebratory lunch. He was a king about to put his final signature on his empire. "Just push the papers over here, Bouchard," Tristan commanded, his voice dripping with triumphant impatience. "I'm signing off on the old man's $15 and claiming my keys. Let's wrap this up." But Mr. Bouchard did not slide the papers. Instead, he placed his palm flat over the signature line, his face hardening into an expression of chilling finality. "Sit down, Muster Vance," Bouchard said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed the cold, crushing weight of a judicial hammer. Tristan froze, his pen hovering centimeters from the paper. "What did you just say?" "The will has been is read. I get the penthouse, the assets, the watches. The paperwork is right there." "You are mistaken," Mr. Bouchard replied with infuriating calm. He reached down into his leather briefcase on the floor and brought up a second, thinner folder. This one was not made of standard cream parchment. It was bound in heavy, gray cardstock and sealed with a thick, crimson wax stamp bearing the official crest of the Superior Court of Justice of Ontario. What I have just read to you was the conclusion of the original last will and testament. But we are not finished. Tristan slowly dropped back into his chair, his brow furrowing as his triumphant grin began to decay. "What the hell is that?" "This," Bouchard said, tapping the red wax seal with his fingernail, "is a legally binding codicil, an addendum to your mother's estate, registered, witnessed, and notarized exactly 3 weeks ago, just 7 days before her stroke. Under the estate laws of Ontario, this document explicitly supersedes, revokes, and replaces all previous articles regarding the disposition of the primary estate. The word supersedes hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus Kane's eyes went wide, and Tristan's face flushed an ugly, furious purple. He slammed both hands onto the table, half rising from his seat as he pointed a shaking finger at the red wax document. "This is a scam!" Tristan shrieked, his voice cracking, all of his polished Bay Street composure evaporating in an instant. "My mother was sick. She was suffering from severe cognitive decline, memory loss, and dementia in her final weeks. She didn't know what she was signing. She was completely manipulated, probably by this bankrupt old carpenter. I will contest this. I have the best estate litigators in Toronto on speed dial. Bouchard, we will tear this cheap piece of paper to shreds in court. Mister!" Bouchard did not blink. He did not look rattled. He simply watched Tristan's frantic, desperate outburst with the bored detachment of a judge who had seen 1,000 spoiled children throw the exact same tantrum. With excruciating slowness, Bouchard reached into the gray folder and pulled out a second, multi-page document bound in heavy blue legal backing. "I anticipated that exact desperate defense, Tristan," Bouchard said, his voice cutting through the panic like ice. "Which is why, at your mother's explicit request, a 48-hour comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluation was conducted 72 hours prior to the signing of this codicil. It was performed by a panel of 3 independent, board-certified neurologists and psychiatrists from the Toronto General Hospital." Bouchard slid the heavy blue document across the polished mahogany. It came to a stop directly over the $20 bill Tristan had thrown at me earlier. "I will summarize their unanimous, legally binding findings for you," Bouchard continued, leaning forward. Elizabeth Tremblay-Vance was entirely lucid, in full command of her faculties, and possessed a level of mental acuity superior to 99% of individuals in her demographic. She was not insane, Tristan. She was simply, as she stated to me, finally done with your greed. Tristan sank back into his chair. This time, he didn't just sit. He collapsed like a building whose internal pillars had been imploded. All the waxy, arrogant color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, ghostly white. I watched him closely. Beads of cold, greasy sweat began to break out along his hairline, slowly running down his temples and dripping onto the collar of his pristine, $3,000 Tom Ford shirt. The expensive fabric, which had felt like armor just 5 minutes ago, now looked loose, suffocating, and far too big for him. He looked like a terrified, trapped child who had suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was entirely hollow. Marcus Kane was staring at the Toronto General Hospital psychiatric report as if it were an active grenade, his hands flat on his knees, not daring to make a single sound. The silence in the room returned, but it was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the crushing, heavy gravity of a trap snapping shut. Tristan stared at the gray folder in Bouchard's hands, his mouth open slightly, letting out tiny, pathetic gasps of air. He was out of moves. He was out of lies. His entire life of luxury and unearned status was hanging by a single thread, and the shears were in the lawyer's hands. "Now, Masher," Bouchard said, putting his gold-rimmed reading glasses back on with absolute, chilling composure. "If there are no further interruptions regarding my client's mental state, let us read the new Article 8. I sat in my corner, my hand resting calmly on my pine cane. The quiet father had waited 20 years for this exact Friday morning. The chessboard had been flipped, and Tristan was about to learn that in the game of vengeance, the final checkmate is always silent. Master Bouchard adjusted his reading glasses, cleared his throat, and looked directly at Tristan, who was shivering in his seat despite the warmth of the office. The courtroom-like silence of the room grew even heavier as the lawyer began to read the handwritten letter attached to the codicil. The words on the page did not belong to Bouchard. They belonged to my late wife, Elizabeth, and they carried her exact cold, sharp, and uncompromising tone. "To my son, Tristan," Bouchard read, his voice echoing in the dead quiet. "I am writing this because I am finally done being a coward. For 20 years, I have allowed you to live, spend, and thrive on a monstrous, toxic lie. A lie that we created, a lie that we nurtured, and a lie that ruined the most honorable man I have ever known. Your father." Tristan let out a dry, rattling gasp, his eyes wide as he stared at the paper in Bouchard's hands. "To understand the truth, Tristan," Bouchard continued, "we must go back to the winter of 2005, inside our old family estate in Westmount, Montreal. You remember that year as the golden dawn of Tremblay Designs. But the truth is, the company was bleeding to death. I had made a series of reckless, arrogant investments, pouring millions into a luxury resort project in the Caribbean that turned out to be a massive scam. We were facing total bankruptcy, public disgrace, and a criminal indictment for fraud and negligence. I was going to prison. The letter went on, dragging the past into the blinding light of the present. In our darkest hour, a lifeline arrived from a private equity group in Dubai, Bouchard read, his voice steady and clinical. They offered to inject 100 million Canadian dollars to stabilize our operations. But it wasn't an investment, Tristan. It was a washing machine. They wanted us to launder their dirty capital through our high-end construction projects. I was hysterical. I collapsed on the office floor, begging, weeping, knowing that if I said no, I went to jail for fraud, and if I said yes, I went to jail for money laundering. I closed my eyes, the memory rushing back so vividly I could almost smell the old wool rugs and the mahogany desk of our Montreal library. I remembered holding Elizabeth by the shoulders as she wept, completely broken by her own ambition. And then, your father stepped in, Bouchard read, and I could hear a slight tremor of emotion in the lawyer's voice. Arthur, the man you have spent 20 years mocking as a worthless carpenter, made a silent, devastating choice to protect us, to protect you, who were then a carefree student at McGill University. Because Arthur was our chief architect and the registered legal guarantor, he rebuilt the corporate ledger. He took the Dubai meetings. He created the shell companies, signed the fraudulent invoices, and directed the wire transfers. He redirected all the legal and criminal fire to himself, building a massive, impenetrable wall of protection around my name and the Tremblay brand. And when the authorities finally came, they saw only his signature. He confessed to crimes he didn't commit, sacrificing his career, his architect's license, and his entire reputation to keep us safe. A choked, pathetic sound escaped Tristan's throat. He was shaking his head violently, his knuckles turning white as he clamped his hands over his ears. No, 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 that's a lie! He's a criminal! He stole from us. She told me he stole from us. Be quiet, Tristan, Master Bouchard commanded, not even looking up as he turned the page to read the most devastating part of Elizabeth's confession. But the worst crime of 2005, Bouchard read, his voice cutting through Tristan's panic like a razor, was not committed by the Dubai group. It was committed by you, Tristan. When you returned home from McGill and discovered the financial chaos, you didn't feel gratitude. You saw an opportunity. You were 22 years old, greedy, and hungry for control. You secretly gathered the documents your father had signed to save us, falsified bank records, and presented them to me as proof that Arthur was embezzling money behind my back. You threatened to go to the media, demanding that I divorce him and cast him out with absolutely nothing. The silence in the room was absolute, frozen, and suffocating. Marcus Kane was staring at the floor, not even breathing, while Tristan's eyes bulged with pure, unadulterated terror. And I, Bouchard read, the words of my late wife dripping with bitter, painful self-loathing. In my cowardice, in my desperate need to preserve my wealth and the glamorous facade of Tremblay Designs, agreed to your monstrous scheme. I chose the easy lie. I let you paint your father as a criminal. I divorced him, stripped him of his share of the estate, and allowed you to treat him like trash for 20 years. Every time you mocked his 15-year-old car, his simple clothes, and his quiet life, you were throwing stones at the giant who had carried the weight of our sins on his back. Your entire $160 million empire was built on his sacrifice, and we rewarded him with absolute exile. I sat in my old gray suit, my calloused hands resting on my pine cane, feeling a tear slowly run down my weathered cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was the burning, agonizing warmth of a validation that had been stolen from me for 20 long years. The quiet father had kept the secret to protect his family. But the truth, just like the cold winter of Canada, has a way of freezing everything in its path until the illusion finally shatters. Tristan stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for water, as the entire foundation of his golden life began to turn to dust. Tristan sat frozen, his hands clasped over his ears as if he could physically block the echoes of his mother's voice. But there was no escaping the truth. The illusion of his glorious, self-made empire was dissolving into thin air, and Mr. Bouchard was about to deliver the final, crushing blow. We now arrive at the final, binding clause of Article 8, Bouchard read, his voice dropping into a tone of supreme, icy authority. Therefore, having stated the unvarnished truth, and in an effort to correct a betrayal that can never be fully undone, I hereby decree my final, absolute wish. The entirety of my estate, including all liquid assets, stocks, bonds, the Yorkville penthouse, and most importantly, My 100% controlling interest in Tremblay Designs Inc., valued at over 160 million Canadian dollars, is hereby given, devised, and bequeathed in its entirety to my ex-husband, Arthur Vance. No. Tristan let out a weak, strangled shriek, his hands falling limply to his sides. His eyes bulged as he stared across the table at me. You are stripped of all executive titles, all operational power, and all access to company funds, effective immediately, Bouchard continued, completely ignoring Tristan's gasp. You are no longer an employee of Tremblay Designs. You are an outsider. You own nothing. Tristan crumpled in his chair, his expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looking loose and pathetic on his shaking frame. He looked up at Mr. Bouchard, his eyes bloodshot, desperate for even a single scrap from the table he thought was laid for him. Is that it? Tristan whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. A trust fund? An allowance? She couldn't. She wouldn't leave me with absolutely nothing. There is one final bequest. Tristan, Mr. Bouchard. Mr. Bouchard said coldly. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a single, pre-written bank check, and slid it across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. It skidded with a soft, whispering sound before stopping right in front of Tristan's trembling hands. To my son, Tristan, Bouchard read from the letter, who has spent his entire life consuming a fortune he did not earn while mocking the father who sacrificed his own life to build it. I leave precisely what he so thoughtfully and publicly offered to his father. I leave him exactly 15 Canadian dollars. Let this cash be used to purchase a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to leave Toronto. Go find a cold, empty town, Tristan, and learn how to start over from absolute scratch, with nothing but your own two hands, just as your father was forced to do. Tristan stared down at the $15 check. The very humiliation he had planned for me had been meticulously calculated, notarized, and handed back to him by his own mother. The poetic justice was absolute, and it was crushing him alive. Before Tristan could even process the absolute ruin of his life, a new predator in the room smelled blood. Marcus Kane, the calculating financial advisor who had been laughing at me just minutes prior, immediately realized that his patron was dead in the water. Without a single second of hesitation, Marcus turned his back on Tristan. Arthur Vance, Marcus said, his voice suddenly dripping with a sickening, submissive sweetness. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, black USB drive, sliding it deferentially toward my end of the table. If I may, I have kept a meticulous, private ledger. On this drive is the complete financial history of the last 3 years, documenting exactly how Tristan has been secretly embezzling funds from Tremblay Designs to pay for his Yorkville lifestyle and Genevieve's lavish expenses. I was forced to help him, but I want to cooperate fully with you to restore the company's integrity. Tristan's head snapped toward Marcus. His eyes, already wild with grief and humiliation, turned completely bloodshot with a murderous, animalistic rage. You rat! Tristan roared. With a feral shriek, Tristan launched himself across the mahogany table. He didn't care about the lawsuits, the lawyers, or his $1,000 suit. He was a cornered beast. He slammed into Marcus, his hands locking around the financial advisor's throat as they both crashed onto the floor. I'll kill you! I'll tear your throat out! Tristan screamed, his face turning a dark, blotchy purple as he squeezed, spittle flying from his lips. Get him off me! Security! Marcus gasped, his face turning blue as he thrashed on the carpet. Before Tristan could do any real damage, the boardroom doors flew open. 2 towering, broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits rushed into the room. With brutal, practiced efficiency, they grabbed Tristan by his shoulders, tearing him away from Marcus. They spun Tristan around, pinning his arms behind his back with a violent, bone-popping twist, and slammed him face first against the glass window overlooking Bay Street. Let me go! I am Tristan Vance! I own this city! Tristan shrieked, his voice rising to a pathetic, high-pitched wail as tears of pure humiliation finally spilled over his cheeks. His expensive cashmere coat was ripped at the seam, and his hair was a wild, disheveled mess. Take him out of my office and call the Toronto police, Master Bouchard commanded, his voice cold and completely unbothered by the violence. The guards began to drag Tristan backward out of the boardroom. His expensive leather shoes scuffed pathetically against the polished granite floor. You did this, old man, Tristan screamed at me, his head twisting back as the double doors began to close. I'll kill you! You're a thief! You're nothing! I'll burn it all down! His voice faded into a distant, echoing wail as the elevators took him down to the street level, leaving nothing behind but the shattered glass of a spilled water carafe on the mahogany table. The king of Bay Street was gone, dragged away in handcuffs like a common criminal. The quiet father had delivered his audit. and the price of Tristan's arrogance was absolute, unmitigated ruin. The silence that rushed back into the room was profound. It felt thick, heavy, and cold, like the air after a fierce Canadian blizzard has finally run its course. I stood there, looking at the wreckage of my son's crown, the overturned leather chairs, the shattered glass of the water carafe on the floor, and the 2 crumpled bills of paper resting alone on the polished mahogany table. The $15 inheritance check and the $20 bill Tristan had thrown at my chest. They sat there side by side, silent monuments to his spectacular, self-inflicted ruin. Marcus Kane had evaporated from the room the moment the guards dragged Tristan out, desperate to save whatever was left of his own pathetic life. Now, there were only 2 of us. Me, the man who had suddenly been handed a $160 million empire, and Mr. Bouchard, the quiet executor of this devastating legal audit. Bouchard did not reach for the financial ledgers. He did not talk to me about stock transfers, the Yorkville penthouse, or the keys to the family vaults. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He slid it across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. It made a sharp, clean metallic ring as it came to a stop near my calloused hand. It was a single, old-fashioned brass key. The wealth, the corporate power, and the properties, those were Elizabeth's long-overdue compensation to you, Arthur, Bouchard said, his voice soft, shedding its formal courtroom detachment. But this is what she truly wanted you to have. What is this for, Mr. Bouchard? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. It is the key to the wall safe hidden behind her portrait in her private study at the Westmount Estate in Montreal, Bouchard explained, offering a knowing, respectful smile. There are no Patek Philippe watches in that safe. There is no gold. Inside, you will find the original, unredacted files from 2005. Every encrypted email from the Dubai group, every signature Elizabeth forged, and the physical proof that you took the fall to protect her and Tristan. It is the absolute, irrefutable evidence of your innocence. I reached out and picked up the small brass key. The metal was freezing cold, sending a sharp, grounding chill directly into my rough, wood-shaved palm. This tiny piece of brass was the heaviest thing in the entire building. It held the power to destroy Tristan completely. With these documents, I could easily hand my son over to the federal authorities and watch him spend the next 20 years behind the iron bars of a penitentiary for his role in the original cover-up and his recent financial fraud. I looked out the window at the distant, icy waters of the harbor. I won't be using these documents to send him into a cell, Mr. Bouchard, I said quietly, my decision settling in my chest like solid granite. Bouchard looked at me, his eyes narrowing slightly with quiet curiosity. You are going to bury them, Arthur? After everything he did to you? No, I replied, a cold, dry smile touching my lips. I am going to keep them in my woodworking shop, locked away where only I can see them. Sending Tristan to prison would give him a ceiling, a routine, and a structured life paid for by the state. That is far too merciful. The greatest punishment for a man who built his entire soul on the illusion of Bay Street wealth is to let him live in the real world. Let him walk the cold, unforgiving streets of Toronto, knowing that he is a $15 man. Let him feel the stinging, silent contempt of the very socialites who once bowed to him, now that he has no Tremblay name, no penthouse, and no future to hide behind. The weight of his own insignificance will be a far heavier cage than any prison cell. Bouchard stared at me for a long moment, before offering a deep, respectful nod of agreement. He understood. The quiet father did not need to scream to destroy. The audit was closed, and the books were finally balanced. I left the high-rise towers of Bay Street behind that very afternoon, catching the evening train back to the north. Now, I am sitting in my small, heated workshop in Gravenhurst, Muskoka. Outside my window, the Canadian winter is still raging, wrapping the deep lakes and ancient granite rocks in a thick, protective blanket of white. But inside, the wood stove is burning hot, casting a warm, golden glow across the sawdust on the floor. I am sitting on the rocking chair I spent weeks building, gently rocking gently in the quiet room. On the mantelpiece above me, next to the portrait of my family, sits my grandfather's carving axe safely recovered from Montreal and the small brass key. My son, my daughters-in-law, and the ruthless wolves of the financial district looked at my old gray suit, my 15-year-old Civic, and my silent, humble life, and they assumed I was a weak, helpless victim. They believed they could stomp on my dignity, steal my memories, and throw me into the frozen dark without a single consequence. But they made a fatal, irreversible mistake. They forgot that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who are building the most devastating plans. I was never weak. I was simply waiting for the winter to freeze their foundations before I brought down the entire house. I have my name back. I have my honor back, and my life is finally, truly beginning. This experience has taught me a powerful lesson. The truth has a weight and a patience of its own. A lie built on silence and shame can never last forever, and no matter how deeply it is buried under millions of dollars, it will eventually claw its way to the surface. True honor is not about the brand of your suit or the location of your penthouse. It is about the silent, thankless sacrifices you make, and a name cleared by truth is an inheritance worth far more than any fortune. What would you have done with that brass key and the crushing weight of a $160 million empire? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If Arthur's journey of quiet strength and absolute justice touched your heart, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Vengeance Never Sleeps channel, and share this video with those who need to remember that respect is never negotiable. Stay safe, stay strong in the cold, and until next time, remember, vengeance never sleeps.